Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Going to reflect on the nature of change as a concept in order to investigate what changes the new media has furnished. We'll probe into the nature of change as a concept. We'll invoke Michel Foucault here, who is a French philosopher, and his concept of the epistemic break. We will take recourse to Michel Foucault's idea of epistemic break. So, what Foucault means by epistemic break is a kind of rupture between what is otherwise apparently perceived to be continuous. Let me give you an example. Imagine two disciplines that Foucault talks about. Number one is the gradual transformation of philology into linguistics, number one, and number two So, let us consider these two sets of examples: the transformation of linguistics, the evolution of linguistics from philology as a discipline, and the evolution of chemistry from alchemy as a discipline. One would imagine linguistics to be an inevitable evolution from philology giving way to linguistics, likewise alchemy to chemistry. So, one may ask, like, whether these two disciplines, these are two bodies of knowledge systems. So, what Foucault argues here is not necessarily that we are going to see this as an inevitable outcome of the former, as in linguistics not necessarily as an inevitable outcome of philology, but there are certain orientations, what Foucault calls episteme. It comes from here. Yeah, so what Foucault argues is linguistics as a 19th century discipline is a reorientation of knowledge system altogether, and so is chemistry. So, one could possibly view this chemistry as a inevitable evolution, to be evolving inevitably from alchemy, or otherwise going by the Foucauldian argument, we could say that there is a rupture, there is a break between how linguistics evolved from philology, how chemistry evolved from alchemy. So, instead what Foucault says is there is a break in between. So, in other words, linguistics or chemistry as a set of knowledge system is coordinating and reorienting how things were sought to be understood. So, these are two fundamentally different radical sets of bodies of knowledge. So, in other words, we invoke these examples to get a sense of, there are two ways of looking into change as a concept. One could look change as a continuity, as a natural process of evolution, or one could look something that is radically new as a break from the past. And this is in a sense something that the Aristotelian classic Aristotelian problem of the sheep of Thesis also hinted at. So, there are two ways of looking into change. One could look into change as a continuous process, as evolutionary, as evolving out the new gradually evolving out of the new. That could be one way, or the other way of seeking to understand change is to assume that there is a epistemic break in between. So, what we perceive, in other words, what we perceive to be as new, as a shift away from what was old. So, the reason that we invoked this distinction and this concept, this very concept of epistemic break, is to now reflect on whether the new media as a recent system of knowledge should be viewed as evolutionary, as a gradual outcome of the old media, or should we assume that there is a radical break in between. So, drawing on the Foucauldian concept of epistemic break, what we are trying to think through is, are we going to then consider the new media as gradually evolving out of old media, or should we, after Foucault, should we, taking lead from Foucault, assume that there is an epistemic break between the old and new media. So, this is a problem that will keep on recurring as we move through the course, as we get going. This is one recurrent problem that will come up in the course of our discussion. So, Foucault's concept of epistemic break, keeping this aside for now, I will try to explain this through a simple, very simple example, which is the example of the scutoids. As some of us will be aware, yeah, so this is one shape that has recently been quote unquote discovered, like geometricians have maybe a month ago, or maybe a couple of months at most. So, this came in the news fairly recently, that geometricians have discovered this shape which is called the scutoid. But now also there are philosophers who have debunked this claim to discovery, saying that a shape cannot be new anyway. So, the argument being, what we see here in the diagram is a set of shapes that has been combined to form a new shape. If you see, the diagram has hexagon, the diagram has pentagon, the diagram has hexagon, the diagram has rectangles, and the diagram has also triangles. So, these are shapes which were already in our imagination. So, these are shapes which we were familiar with. Now, these shapes, the triangle, the hexagon, the pentagon and the rectangle are combined in a certain way in order to furnish what the geometrician are now calling the scutoid. So, the claim to discovery is premised on, not so much, if we think, not so much on the newness, not so much on the innovativity of what has been discovered, but a kind of a combinatory scheme that has rendered all these otherwise familiar shapes combined in a new form. I mean, this is something that happens in chemistry all the time. We have a set of known compounds, we have a set of known elements which are reacted and combined in a certain element to form otherwise what we call a new element, a new compound. So, in other words, the geometricians claim to discovery, in most cases the philosophers have debunked it, saying that this cannot be a new shape, because the whatever shape that we have here is already known to us. So, let us try to think through this problem through Foucault's concept of the epistemic break. This, in a way, these two speak to each other, like taking off from here our concern about the new media, and this problem I am trying to transpose it in the context of the new media, and what we are trying to think through and what we are going to discuss as the course moves on is, then new media is a radically new phenomenon, a certain kind of transformative combinatory potential of the old media that has rendered the new media its newness. So, we will keep this here for now, like this is a question that will recur in the course of our discussion. Yeah, one other pertinent example would be the words, the English words, the words that we use in our daily speech and daily writings. If we think carefully, words are permutations and combinations of 26 alphabets. So, this is in other words a limited set. So, this limited set comprises of 26 alphabets, but if we now consider that with this 26 alphabets we actually form unlimited number of words, and if we look into, say for example, the online Oxford dictionary, there is a new word comes up every often. Every often the dictionary suggests that there is a new word that has been coined. So, it is not that the combinatory potential of the words makes the new word new, but it is rather the association with the meaning of words that gives newness to the words. So, we do not have to necessarily think newness in terms, seek newness in what is rather apparent. There are other nuances that could render newness. So, now we will get into the semantics of the word media, its root, its etymology and where it comes from. So, the word media is reminiscent of medium, medium as in an interface, and grammatically speaking it is the plural form of medium. So, it is grammatically speaking it is the plural form of medium. This is the singular, media is the plural. So, Raymond Williams, an English theorist, and he in tracing the root of the word media to medium, actually he in his, there is a book called Keywords by Raymond Williams. It came out in the 1980s, and Raymond Williams had a very interesting, very checkered career, interesting trajectory. He was not an academic in his early, he actually served in the World War, and when he writes in the introduction to his Keywords that after having served in the war, when he comes back to England, he realizes there are certain words. So, he was away serving in the war for quite a number of years. So, when he comes back to England, he realizes that some of the words, the way he used to use them has changed and it has acquired new meaning. So, in the context of the words that we use, imagine the word hot and the cool, like we say like he is a cool dude. So, that does not mean temperature wise, heat wise somebody is cool. So, or when we say somebody is hot, we do not necessarily mean that temperature wise somebody is hot. So, there are ways like in which certain words acquire new meanings. So, thinking in this sense, so the hot has become the new cool and the cool has become the new hot in the way that we use hot and cool today. They have kind of swapped their meaning. So, similarly, so likewise when Raymond Williams, after having served in the wars, comes back to England, he realizes there are certain words which have acquired new meanings, and there are certain words which have become obsolete, and there are certain words which are used in a completely different sense. So, what he decides is to write a book which was later published as Keywords. It is kind of a dictionary, kind of a lexicon, where he writes, where he has entries of different words alphabetically, and those certain words which has changed meaning during his lifetime, and he traces kind of the evolution of the semantic history of the word. He traces the semantic history of the words that he has entered in his Keywords. So, Raymond Williams has an entry called media in his Keywords, and I will read what he has to say about media and the diverse range of meanings that, and imagine Raymond Williams was writing in the late 20th century. So, he looks into the evolutionary scheme of the semantic history of the word media. So, in tracing the root of the word media to medium, Raymond Williams in his keywords is affirming that the word medium has been regularly used in the English language since the 16th century. And from at least 17th century, it has had the sense of an intervening or intermediate agency or substance, like as I said, like media as interface, media as intermediating substance. So, this is a kind of semantic tone, semantic meaning that the word acquires since the 17th century, according to Raymond Williams. More to it, Williams mentions three aspects of meaning that the word media now invokes, and I will read it out from his keywords, and I am using the 1983 edition, page 203. I will read it out. He says, there has probably been a convergence of three senses. Number 1, the old general sense of an intervening or intermediate agency or substance. Number 2, the conscious technical sense, as in the distinction between print and sound and vision as media. Number 3, the spatialized capitalist sense, in which a newspaper or broadcasting service, something that already exists or can be planned, is seen as a medium for something else, such as advertising. So, what Raymond Williams says in tracing the root of the word media and also tracing the semantic history is, Williams is giving us three sense that the word media now invokes, is a sense of intermediacy, Yes, we often in the common parlance, like in planchet, we call like the medium is like is a key terminology. Like this gives you a sense of intermediacy. So, the sound is like a medium of expression. The visual, as in painting, cinema is a medium of our visual vocabulary, and imagine advertising, which is a medium of something. There is a message that the advertising tries to convey you. So, these are the three senses that media invokes. That is what Raymond Williams is saying in his keywords. So, what this semantic evolution points to is that the dichotomy between the old and the new media is not entirely new. So, what I am suggesting here is like this is a transformation, this is a semantic evolution that Raymond Williams is trying to plot and trace after he is back from the war. So, there is a distinction already happening between the old kind of media, which is to say the sense that it carries when Raymond Williams says intermediacy or the sound like these are the three senses. So, these are the gradual semantic progression that the word media has acquired. So, in a sense, if we are going by Raymond Williams here, there is a trajectory, there is a trajectory of evolution, there is a transformation from old to new happening, and which is evident in the sense of its semantic transformation. So, this shift from old to new is not entirely new, although the new media as a phenomenon is characteristic of the times that we live in now, associated with cultures of digitality and internet and so on and so forth. But what I am trying to taking cues from Raymond Williams suggesting is this transformation is not entirely new. It was there when Raymond Williams was writing his keywords. So, it is estimated, let me now give you a few examples to make this thing clear. So, it is estimated that the first alphabet appeared in Palestine as early as the 16th century BC. In 105 AD, the Chinese court announced the invention of paper. So, now hieroglyphics and paper based scriptures, like the invention in Palestine, the alphabet, and the invention of paper in China. So, these are two fundamentally different medium. So, the latter, as in the Chinese invention of paper, involves modern technological innovation. So, paper was invented through a series of other technological devices and other technological innovations rendered the invention of paper possible. So, is a newer medium compared to the former, as in the alphabets. So, the technique of block printing was in vogue in China at least since the 6th century, while it came to Europe as late as the 13th century. So, if you realize there is a lapse of a few hundred years when block printing was being used in practiced in China and when it arrives in Europe. So, there is a huge temporal gap here. So, this implies that the medium of block printing was considered new in Europe when it was not new at China. In other words, when block printing was as a medium, when block printing was considered old and dated in China, it was arriving in Europe. So, however, any of this new, I gave you two examples like the invention of paper in China and the arrival of block printing in Europe. So, these are new given the history and context, these are new emergences, but none of us would be agreeable to ascribing or bracketing these inventions, these emergences as new media. So, the invention of paper or the arrival of block printing in Europe is not necessarily bracketed as new media. What I am trying to make a distinction here is between the new media with capital N and capital M, like the new media, as opposed to new or like newer forms of medium, like with small n and small m. Like new media is one thing, and when spelt with the capital N and capital M, it is the new media, that is a different thing. So, as I said, like block printing when it came in Europe wasn't new media with capital N, but it was newer form of expression, it was a newer form of medium, so to say. So, it was, yet it was not new media. So, what this points to, and this should be obvious by now, that the new media with capital N and capital M is not just a function of time, it is not just a function of place, or it is not just a matter of technological innovation, but it rather signifies the potential to blur the distinction between interpersonal and mass communication, the ideas of interactivity, the ideas of communication practices, and the interaction between the public and private life. So, there is a distinction that has been blurred by the new media. So, this is, as I said, cannot be just read as function of time, place, or communication or innovativity. Say for example, it is just new media is not just a innovation. There are implications both political and personal, and that is going to comprise the rest of our course. So, this has personal and political implications, largely speaking ideological implications. So, those are the issues that we are going to probe as we get going. So, there is a transformative potential, there is an emancipatory potential that the new media offers us, and associated with it are ideological implications. We are going to look that for the rest of the course. So, now we will try to make sense of the characteristic that we generally ascribe to new media, and try to think of the change in the light of whatever we discussed so far. So, while it is a cliche to say that we live in a media saturated world, and as we realize that everything around us is kind of mediatized. I mean, the course that you are doing is being mediatized, is being recorded and replayed and being aired. Anything we see around us is basically mediatized, and imagine our life without the cell phone. Like, we cannot imagine our life without the cell phone. So, in other words, we are living in a very media saturated world, and we are always connected, we are always on the go, and we are always connected, and we are, in Dana Boyd's word, we live a life which Dana Boyd calls the always on lifestyle. Like, most of us are always already online. Our mobile data is on, we are either on the internet, we are surfing things, we are streaming things, we are downloading things, and this is something what Dana Boyd calls the always on lifestyle. So, we seldom realize that this media saturation, I mean, this is so ubiquitous, and the saturation has hit to such an extent that we often do not realize. I mean, things that are very obvious aren't sometimes very apparent. So, this always on lifestyle, this very ubiquity, this very pervasiveness of the media characterizes new media. So, this is characteristic of new media. So, in other words, the qualitative difference in interconnectivity of new media characterizes its newness. So, think of the 19th century print media, and there are other examples that could be multiplied. If we say, for example, the broadcast media, the print media, or the radio, and so on and so forth, these weren't interactive, so to say, as opposed to the kind of media that we now are familiar with. Like, these are very digitally oriented, these are very internet savvy, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, there is a shift from media being as a passive object of consumption to media suddenly becoming, with the help of internet and the new media, the media becomes very interactive. So, this is one of the characteristic of new media. So, the accessibility of the internet has led to this emergence of interactive digital platforms that has fundamentally changed our perception of media, as I invoke the examples of 19th century print media, and say, for example, Facebook or social medias like Facebook and the Twitter, and so on and so forth. So, these are so interactive that we often do not realize that we are what Dana Boyd has called the always on lifestyle. So, our cell phone is always the mobile data on our cell phone is already on, and we are always, even on the go, we are interacting with people. So, these are digital platforms which are necessarily interactive, and this has been rendered possible by the cultures of digitality and cultures of internet. So, this in turn has engendered innovative forms of expression, like we do not express ourselves. Say, for example, the kind of advertisements that we used to read on a 19th century newspapers are very different from the kind of advertisements that we find in, say, for example, a WordPress or a blog. And imagine, for example, the way Amazon does its marketing. So, when you buy anything, that Amazon, through algorithms and through like cookies or internet history and so on and so forth, they make sense of your internet traffic, your internet behavior, and will prompt you to buy things. Like, when we buy things, there will be a panel that shows people who bought this also bought this, and these guesses that Amazon makes are in most cases pretty accurate. So, these are precise guesses. So, this is an expression of advertisement which is radically different from say for example 19th century print media advertisements. So, this is a kind of expression that I am hinting at. So, this is a kind of expressing ourselves, the kind of interactivity which has been rendered possible by the digital sphere as we move along from the so called literacy to post literacy. So, I am little bit resistant about, like I think I mentioned that this is an expression of progress, we are progressing, and these are again, like if we invoke the Foucauldian concept of the epistemic break here, there is an implicit assumption that we are progressing, this idea of incremental progress. So, what we know today is necessarily more than what we had known yesterday, and what we would know tomorrow will be incrementally more than what we know today. So, in other words, there is an incremental progress of knowledge. This is what Foucault calls like the incremental progress. So, there is this shift as we imagine time from modern to postmodern, from literacy to post literacy, and so on to so forth. This is what Yes. So, as we progress from the literacy to post literacy, this is assumption that we are incrementally getting better in terms of how we acquire knowledge, what we know, and so on and so forth. We are incrementally progressing. So, when we think through ideas of new media, we also try to problematize this concept of incremental progress. So, this is in other words what we call teleology. The word teleology comes from logic Yes. So, the word teleology comes from combining two words telos and logic, and if you go into the etymology of telos, the word telos comes from time. So, in other words, teleology is the logic of time. So, the idea of teleology and what I have called like the incremental the idea of incremental progress is, as gradually time passes, we are incrementally getting better, we are incrementally acquiring more knowledge. So, this is the increasing progression of knowledge. This is an idea of progress. So, we imagine progress to be incremental over time. So, from the era of text based media to which is the domain of the old media, the 19th century print media, and so on and so forth. From text based media, we are gradually incrementally progressing. When I say progressing, I am with all the caveats involved, like within single quotes, we are progressing from text based media to the digital medium. So, this is a progression. So, this is one progression that we generally ascribe to new media. So, the new media, for instance, and I will read this out from Wikipedia, says, so Wikipedia says the new media refers to on demand access to content anytime, anywhere, on any digital device, as well as interactive user feedback and creative participation. Another aspect of new media is the real time generation of new and unregulated content, end quote. So, this is one way of understanding new media, and this is a quotation from Wikipedia. So, that I am able to retrieve this definition from a tablet before me, and I am empowered to make edits on the content of the Wikipedia page in real time, and I am allowed to embed the hyperlink in, say for example, the slides that I use in my teaching. So, this is a kind of an interactivity, this is a kind of a saturation, and this is a kind of a convergence, where all different kinds of media activities converge. This is, in other words, illustrating what is fundamentally new in the new media. This is something that we could not have imagined to have done with old 19th century text based print capitalist media. In other words, there is a convergence of different media scapes, so to say, different media platforms that can be embedded. So, I do not have to necessarily go to a library to look into a book and bring this definition to you. I can read it right from a tablet, connect it to the internet, and I can use the hyperlink, directly embed the hyperlink onto my slides, and I can also edit the contents of the Wikipedia as an user and as a consumer. I can read stuff on Wikipedia, and I can review and re-edit things that does not meet my approval. So, this is there is a sense of empowerment, like I can do all of this without necessarily going to a library, necessarily having to pull out my laptop or things like that. So, this gives a sense of empowerment. So, this is a characteristic of new media. So, what I mean by media convergence here, as I have been reiterating this characteristic of new media, is, say for example, the smartphone we are using. So, we can use the smartphone as a camera, we can upload the pictures taken, photographs taken with the camera onto our Facebook through our phone, and we can also do a whole diverse range of activities just on a single piece of smartphone. Or for example, nowadays we can surf the internet, even forget about laptop, we can surf it on an HD TV, for example. So, the TV, if we go by the 19th century understanding of things, the TV is primarily a broadcast medium, but then TV in the modern post digital imagination has, or may be to a certain extent, be used as an internet surfing device. So, this is what I mean by media convergence, and this has been rendered possible by the emergence of the cultures of digitality and internet. So, this is like the media convergence, media saturation, and a sense of empowerment that I referred to. These are all characteristic of the new media.